Welcome everybody. Sorry, we've been having a few slight technical problems this morning, so please bear with us. But I'll start off by welcoming everybody to the latest in FlightGlobal's series of webinars, which we're organising to examine the impact of the coronavirus on aviation. I'm Max Kingsley-Jones, I'll be your host today. Last week, we heard from two eminent analysts on what the crisis could mean for airlines and the aerospace sector. Today's webinar is titled Airline Chiefs on Surviving a Crisis. And I'll be speaking to three leaders who have steered their businesses through previous meltdowns and survived to tell the tale. So I'm going to welcome three eminent airline CEOs. We only have one available at the moment due to some technical issues. That's Christoph Müller, but we'll also be joined by Monty Brewer and Tony Tyler. Monty's actually dialing in from Tucson, Arizona, so it's just 12 a.m. where he is. But Monty was Chief Executive of Air Canada from 2004 to 2009. And prior to that, he was at United Airlines, where he held many senior executive roles. Christoph and Tony are both in Asia at the moment, so they're enjoying a much more civilized time zone. Christoph has led several airlines as Chief Executive, including Malaysia Airlines, Aer Lingus, Hapag-Lloyd, and Sabena Group, where he has focused on turnaround and recovery. More recently, Christoph served Emirates Group as EVP for Digital Transformation and Innovation. Tony worked for Cathay Pacific for more than 3 decades, finishing up as Chief Executive for 4 years before joining IATA in 2011 as Director General and CEO. He spent 5 years with the association before stepping down in 2016. Before we start, a quick bit of housekeeping. This discussion will last about an hour. And while I will lead the interrogation of our battle-hardened executives, we will also like to try and answer as many of your questions as possible. You can type them in. And I'm just getting messages that people can't hear me, but hopefully you can. You can type them into the Q&A at the bottom. And I should warn you that you can't see other open questions. Okay, some people can hear me, that's good. So we get a large number of questions based on previous experience, but you won't be able to see those. So don't think yours is the only question. And my colleague Murdo Morrison, who is Head of Strategic Content for FlightGlobal, who's joined me today, he will be selecting the questions for me to pose. If you have any technical problems, as some people already have been, you can use the chat icon at the bottom, but please don't use the chat icon for the questions because we'll be filtering the questions through the Q&A. And just to let you know, we've already got over 600 participants on the call today, and it's going up quite quickly at the moment. So that gives you a scale of the audience we have. So I was going to put my first question actually to Christoph. Welcome, Christoph. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. So would you like to outline, Christoph, your experience? So there's been many meltdowns in the last 20 or 30 years, and obviously you've been at the forefront of some of those. Just tell us from your perspective where you were for the different meltdowns and how you sort of treated them at the time.
Yeah, well, most probably working as long as Tony, Monty and I in the airline industry, we were first confronted with the first Gulf War, which was beginning of the 90s. And it was not only the Gulf War which triggered that meltdown in the industry, but as you recall, or most of you might not recall, but the IATA pricing regime had been just lifted. And most airlines, having been flag carriers before, were a little bit like rabbits in the headlights. It was a little bit the last man standing tactics, and that had almost cost most airlines their lives in 93 and 94. And the second major crisis, most people make reference to 9/11 really as the beginning of the second largest crisis in the airline industry. But you might recall that the internet bubble had burst already 9 months before. And for example, traffic on the transatlantic was down 30%. So 9/11 was the catalyst event, but not the triggering event necessarily. So, but again, the reaction time in that crisis was extremely slow. And I had to file for bankruptcy with Sabina because our principal shareholder, Swissair, went into receivership largely 8 weeks before we did, and there was simply no funding from the shareholder available. The rest of the story is very well known. We launched Brussels Airlines 24 hours later, and that is still a very healthy and proud airline. Then the financial crisis, 8 and 9, I was changing at that point in time from TUI Travel PLC, where I was responsible for the, at the time, 7 charter carriers in the group, and went to Aer Lingus. The crisis really bottomed out in Ireland only in 2012. So 2008 to 2012 was a decline in demand of 35% just in the Irish market. And that was probably a lesson learned. But already at that time, airlines were able to respond faster. So the need for speed has been learned over time. And if you now take the Corona crisis, what's most incredible to see how fast people are now reacting and taking really tough decisions. Inconceivable 30 years ago, I would say. The ash crisis, I also experienced at Aer Lingus, but it was not really a crisis. In Formula One terms, it was a little bit like the safety car came out. So everything was neutralized for a couple of days. We were all sitting on our hands. We knew it would not last long, but of course, we also have learned a lot in terms of crisis management. So that's a little bit the history of my experience in the aviation industry. In the tourism industry, we had many more crises. Every hurricane in the Caribbean closed down the place for a year. Then we had the Arab Spring. There was something going on in Turkey or in Greece. So the tourism industry, I believe, has experienced many more severe crises where they had to change the entire portfolio over a very, very short period in time. And again, time is of the essence. I believe the velocity with which you take the decision and the decisiveness with which you execute them is paramount for survival.
Thank you, Christoph. We're still waiting for other guests to join just because we have some technical issues. So the spotlight remains on Christoph for the moment. It's funny you mentioned the safety car coming out. It feels like for this crisis, the red flag's been waved and the race has been abandoned at the moment. When you face a crisis like this as a leader or management group, what are your priorities? Where do you have to move fastest? Or are there no priorities? Everything's just as important.
Well, I have always lived according to the principle to put the customers and the employee first. You know, we are working in an industry, of course, where safety is paramount. So particularly in today's world, I think we have to take our hat off to all those flight attendants, to all these check-in people who are still, you know, in the front line, despite, you know, all warnings out. And I believe that is what you have to do really first. Also, customers, I'm kind of stranded here currently in Asia because it's hardly impossible to get through in any call center. So I think that is very, very important. But cash matters. Cash matters. And maybe it's a little bit anecdotal, but I recall the hero at my time was the CFO of Delta Airlines, a lady, I forgot her name. She drew down all available credit lines in the afternoon of 9/11. And that provided Delta Airlines really with a comfort zone, with some headroom, which enabled them to take decisions probably a little bit more founded. So cash is king in these days, but again, safety is paramount and cannot be compromised.
Thank you. I believe Monty's now joined us. So are you able to turn your video on, Monty, and unmute?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Monty. Can't see you.
Nope, no video.
Ah, okay. Well,
it won't let me put the video on.
Okay, well, Monty, sorry we can't see you. It's not because it's the middle of the night.
He hasn't shaved.
Yeah.
I'm hiding my beard.
It's not because it's the middle of the night in Tucson either. It's a technical issue. So Monty, thank you for joining, and apologies for the technical issues. We were just hearing from Christoph about some of the priorities, and he mentioned the being hunkered down in Malaysia, sorry, in Asia. So just from your perspective, I love your story that you tell from 9/11. But first of all, perhaps you could just remind us or tell some of the audience, if they're not aware, where you were through various different crises. In terms of your roles at Airline, sorry, rather than...
Right. So many crises. So September 11th, I was head of senior VP of planning for United Airlines at the time. During SARS, I was at head of commercial for Air Canada, which I don't know if Hong Kong was, obviously in China was hit hard with SARS, but so was Toronto. So it was a fairly big event for us at Air Canada. And then also at a CEO of Air Canada during the financial crisis. And September 11th, we, all the VPs, have a monthly meeting at most airlines. And we had just completed that at United. And we had all gone off to different Star Alliance meetings around the world. Each Star Alliance used to have meetings of every discipline, and the planning meeting was in Bangkok, and that's where I was. And the rest of my planning team was in Hong Kong meeting with the region, and actually half of United's senior executive staff was overseas when September 11th happened. And with the luck of Lufthansa, our good friends, Christoph there at the time, flew us to, got us all, a number of us back to Frankfurt while the flights were not flying to the US. And one of the people with us at the time was our treasurer, who remembered that there was going to be a new, we had an A320 order coming, probably the last one that United had at that time. And we called our San Francisco base to see if we could get into, hey Tony, you need to turn off your, we contacted our maintenance base in San Fran, and they contacted the delivery pilot to say, look, bring back these United executives. And I got a call from him late at night in my hotel room in Frankfurt, and he said, you're my Private Ryan. We're not leaving without you. So a bunch of us got up to Hamburg to the Airbus facility there, and we flew back on a 320.
So you were basically dispersed trying to deal with possibly the biggest crisis of your careers at that point, the United management team.
Yeah, our little office in Frankfurt was, one conference room had, the customer service people were, arguing with TSA about knives and no knives coming through security, things of that sort. And the entire planning process was done by phone. We pulled down the operation by 35% and kind of built the schedules right from that little conference room.
So when you were, I'm sorry, I should welcome Tony now. Thank you, Tony. We've finally got the all three of the Musketeers together, although we have Monty only on video, on audio at the moment. So when you were dealing with this crisis, Monty, how did you determine what you had to turn to first? Obviously, you had no idea then how long it was going to last. We didn't know. I remember it vividly at the time. We didn't know whether we were going to be looking at a sort of catalyst for terrorism across the world. There was no guarantee that what we saw on that dreadful day would not be repeated elsewhere in the coming months. So how did you prepare for that as a leader, and how did you ensure that you could bring the airline back when the business returned?
Well, on September 11th, basically we're in charge of the planning side. So we just literally took a hard guess as to how much capacity to pull. Obviously working with the entire organization, moving quickly to kind of get things re-rostered, restructured. And we were fairly lucky to guess pretty well. Not sure if we guessed well or we just knew how to price it better to fill up what we guessed.
Right. So Tony, welcome. You were obviously for most of your executive career, and you went through quite a few crises, including one as CEO. I know we talked about this the other day. So would you like to just give a quick resume of where you were in terms of the business of Cathay for the various different crises?
Yeah, sure. I mean, well, you know, the first one probably was the Asian financial crisis, which was sort of 1997, 1998. I was director of corporate development, the kind of number 3 role in the company at that time. And then we had, of course, 9/11, and then we had SARS. Again, I was in the same position there, so very much, you know, at the center of things when all those things were happening. And then later I became chief executive, and I was CEO for the global financial crisis, and also for, you know, I was there when incidents happened like the European airspace closures that took place in 2010 because of the alleged presence of ash in the atmosphere. So you know, I saw quite a few ups and downs during my time in the senior ranks at Cathay Pacific.
So how did you prioritize what you had to do? How did you determine where you look first? Because there's so many different things, I guess, to look at almost at the same time, and you've only got limited resource even in the management team.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. On the other hand, when you're in a crisis, things do become pretty clear, and priorities do become pretty clear. And when you're in something, perhaps, you know, the most sort of impressive one of the lot, if you like, was SARS, or, you know, because it was a pretty quick impact and a very drastic impact on Cathay Pacific. And so the main priority was to save cash, because, you know, we had a very strong balance sheet going into it, but you could see with the burn rate that we had, you know, it would have been a matter of months before we had no money left. So we had to save cash. So you do everything possible to do that. We asked staff to take unpaid leave. That was one of the first things we did. We of course went to our suppliers. We stopped all projects that were not, well, basically stopped all projects. I mean, nothing that might be useful next year was important when you needed to make sure you were still going to be around next year. So, and we, you know, you stop advertising, obviously, stop anything you don't have to spend money on today, you stop spending money on. And of course, you go about wanting to raise cash too, so you go to your banks and you make sure they're going to stand behind you. You remember the ones that say yes and the ones that turn away and walk off down the road. And so you just look at every possible opportunity to make sure you've got cash or access to cash, because that's what you need when you're in a crisis like that. And of course, what's happening now is far worse than what we had to handle in SARS, and is different from a number of respects, which I can talk about if you like.
So when do you start those phone calls to government to try and get the government support that we're obviously hearing around the world? Is that quite a quick decision to make, or do you have to think about it? Oh.
Sorry, Max, I've lost you.
Tony's just frozen. So Chris,
I'll try to answer that one. I mean, that's not top of mind. You don't run to the government every time you have a problem, and usually the government doesn't want to hear from you. And so you're basically on your own, and so that's what makes this one very different, because it's basically industry going away, not shrinking, and the government calls you.
Right. In fact, there's been a question we've had.
Well, that doesn't apply everywhere, I don't think, Monty. Sorry, and I couldn't hear Max's question, but if it was about, you know, the role of the government and when you talk to the government, I mean, you know, I think different governments in different places react differently, and certainly, you know, in some, I think in the US it may well be the case that the government's calling the airlines, but that's not happening everywhere. And in many cases, you know, airlines at the moment are beating on the doors of government to ask for help, and they're being turned back. But I was going to say one of the things when you're in that kind of crisis, for the leader of the business, there's a huge need and constant demand to communicate. You know, you just find yourself all the time trying to communicate with the staff, of course, with the public and your customers, with the government, with your regulator, and you that to me was one of the sort of exhausting things about being in a crisis mode, is that for all that's going on around you, you've got to keep communicating, you've got to keep getting the message across to these really important constituencies.
But one thing on government, I mean, the previous crisis, there were demand-led, if you wish, decreasing demand-led. Corporates change their travel policies, there's less discretionary spend in the cabin, rental relatives becomes a lower priority, and insofar, the difference this time is that the movement control order was triggered by governments most of the time. You know, they simply wouldn't allow Europeans to list for a very long time. So for the first time, the government, I would not say is the root cause of the crisis, but we all understand why that is. And the governments will also come in different shapes and forms. And probably there is a form of an escalation. The highest certainly is that governments will take equity in a company and own it. That is a very harsh form, but state aid, they're very regulated in Europe. They work with loans under certain conditions. The mildest form might be a PSO type approach, where nations like New Zealand, sitting on an island, simply see the need to connect to the rest of the world. And I think it's then legitimate that they might subsidize in a very punctuated way, where it's on national interest, really to keep the doors alive. If you would follow in today's
Christoph,
entirely,
just one second, Christoph. Tony, could you just mute because we're just getting a little bit of feedback from your sound. Thank you. Sorry, Christoph. Please continue.
I think if you would follow an entire Darwinistic approach at this point in time, and you would simply say, let's wait and see what happens without any government interference, be it in a mild form of PSO or the full-fledged 100% equity ownership, probably that would take a long time to recover, because simply the airlines are running so fast out of cash that a temporary assistance from the government in some cases is simply inevitable.
Going back to your point, Tony, one question that's come up a lot when we've been discussing this within FlightGlobal is, what are the airline CEOs doing at the moment in this crisis? And you've just sort of shone some light on that. So although they've got no network to run really, certainly around Europe at the moment, they obviously are very busy people. You're saying the management team are very busy, even though they don't seem to have a business to run at the moment.
Well, yes, I think there's a lot to do. I mean, managing what's going on with their people is a huge issue at the moment. I mean, airlines everywhere are, I'm sure, trying to work out how can we stop the sort of cash bleeding out of the company in all sorts of ways, and paying your staff is a huge cash outflow every month. But at the same time, you want to look after your staff. I mean, nobody wants to make people redundant or put them out of work and leave them without income. So how can you try and reconcile those two things? And also, you're trying to preserve the shell, if you like, the shell of your company, so that when business comes back and when there's the government restrictions that Christoph talked about have been lifted, that you actually have a company to go back to work for. And so CEOs are trying to manage all these very sort of conflicting priorities at the moment, and it's a very, very difficult job to do that.
There's a question come in, which is a very obvious question, but it's a great question. It's we've heard it a lot in the last few weeks. It's from Jonathan Council, who I know from British Airways. Do we believe that post-crisis there will be a significant consolidation of opportunities within the industry? So I'll put that one to Monty, actually, because obviously you can see it from a US perspective, where there has already been a lot of consolidation since 9/11.
Well, it's gonna, let's put it this way, when everybody comes back, it's gonna be a different world. I don't know if consolidation helps solve some of the issues that airlines will have when they come back, mainly restructuring their balance sheets, trying to figure out how to grow the airline back up? I mean, this is a very unique time because I don't know any time period where the industries had to start from zero, especially with weak balance sheets. So how do you put capacity out there, which is kind of speculative, and hope it gets booked up when you don't have much cash to take too much speculative capacity? So I see that as one of the biggest challenges coming forward, and I'm not sure how consolidation solves that. But there can be issues to be solved, and
I think, if I may, Monty, if we look what happened in the United States after 9/11, it was both. It was a consolidation of legal entities, but first and foremost, it was also a hub consolidation. Memphis disappeared, St. Louis disappeared, Pittsburgh disappeared, Cleveland, and also Newport and Virginia, all forgotten that. So I see really an opportunity, particularly in Europe, maybe for hub consolidation. There is a second form, which I call involuntary consolidation, and I believe we will see some exits of the industry. We will see some exits of the industry, and we have even seen that before Corona, with Flybe, with Thomas Cook. Certain areas in the world haven't consolidated enough. And the third form of consolidation is what I call national consolidation. And the latest or prominent example is BMI and British Airways. It's Lufthansa and Air Berlin. And that, of course, is another call for the government. If you have a very isolated national market, let's say like in Australia, and you pursue that idea of national consolidation, and that would be disadvantageous for the end consumer, because at the end of the day, prices will go up. It will be good for the surviving airline. And I believe consolidation comes in different shapes and form, probably also in different geographies. But I'm a strong believer that we will come out of this crisis with less aircraft and less players.
Right. And that's kind of what happened in the US. I mean, really, it's bankruptcies is what was the tool that was used to allow consolidation to take place, because you could get rid of the excess aircraft from the consolidated airlines, which allowed them to close down all the hubs because they didn't have as many aircraft. So Northwest, Delta, and American, or US Airways and American, was basically using bankruptcy as a way to get the consolidation costs out. And I hope that's not where we're going in the future here.
Yeah, Max, if I may, I think I agree that consolidation is still going to be difficult. The rules that act against international cross-border consolidation are still going to be in place. So I think the sort of consolidation we're going to be getting is where a strong player in a region effectively is going to grow its market share in that region at the expense of the weaker players and at the expense of the airlines that have disappeared because of bankruptcy and failure. So, I mean, in the Asian region, Singapore Airlines has just had a massive recapitalization, a huge injection of equity. It's going to be there when this is all over, and it's going to be in a strong position when this is all over. It'll be able to, get back into the air quickly, and it's going to have a very good future in terms of growth when that's all over. I think, if I may just comment also on Australia, the government in Australia has made it very clear that it wants a two-airline policy, and it's going to have a two-airline industry, if you like. And one way or another, it's going to make sure that there's still going to be competition in the Australian market.
We now have over 700 participants and lots of questions coming in, and they're obviously being filtered. So thanks for everybody for your engagement. You're talking about the survival of the fittest, but we do seem to have those zombie airlines that Willie Walsh often talks about that still seem to be able to find a way through. Do you think this could see the final clear out of those kind of airlines, or do you think there's going to be, you could probably guess some of the airlines I'm referring to without naming names, but do you think governments will actually end up propping up some businesses that really should be allowed to wither and die? Christoph, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, an airline to a certain degree is nothing else than a piece of national infrastructure. It's not much different to a highway, if you wish. And there are nations which are highly dependent on international trade. And I was exactly in that situation when we filed for bankruptcy at Sabina. Sabina's hinterland, Belgium's hinterland is Africa, right? If you cut air travel to Africa and air cargo to Africa, the impact on the Belgian industry would have been tremendous. And that is most probably the same for France with their Outremer departments, and it is the same for many, many countries in the world. And insofar, I believe there is a legitimate interest of states really to keep their lifelines intact. That is certainly not the case for a flight from Berlin to Palma de Mallorca, right? But I think airline industry is a piece of national infrastructure, and it's legitimate to support it where it's necessary for the local industry, particularly if there is no other player with the ability to step in, be it traffic light related. There are many, many reasons that not every gap can be filled next day by a new carrier. So I'm not advocating government support. Absolutely, I'm not advocating government support. I'm more on the Darwinistic side of things. But I can very well understand that on a temporary basis and in a very targeted way, it might be of national interest to support aviation and the airline industry in order to keep the supply chains for export-orientated nations like Germany and so on and so forth intact.
I guess that's also why there's always going to be that reluctance to allow foreign overseas investment to go beyond the existing national caps or limits, because there's always that concern that the fact, as you say, they're seen as part of the infrastructure like a motorway or a highway. That's probably always going to keep that debate rolling, I guess, on how much foreign ownership you can have in these big carriers. Maybe Tony, you could answer that.
Yeah, I mean the argument about the nationality rules, if one can just use that as shorthand for airlines, has been going on as long as I've been involved with the industry, and everybody agrees it's a crazy world where foreigners can't own airlines. They can own banks, they can own telcos, they can own pharmaceutical companies, but they can't own airlines. Everyone agrees that it's crazy, and yet nothing's ever done to change it. And at the end of the day, that must be because governments want it that way, despite anything that anybody says to the contrary. So I don't see that is going to change, and it's going to be a huge barrier to consolidation on the one hand, and it's going to both sort of justify and deliver effectively, state aid for airlines. And I think, in this region, for example, in Asia, the national carriers of a lot of Asian countries, whether they're part of state-owned or wholly state-owned, they're going to be supported through this. The question is, what happens to the second-tier carriers, maybe the privately owned carriers, and those are smaller. Sometimes they're smaller, sometimes they're not. But what's going to happen to them? I think that's the question. And how much support will they be getting? And what sort of of unfairness is going to come into the market because of state aid to some but not others? It's a very difficult thing to get right.
Thanks, Tony. We have a lot of questions coming in. They're going into the Q&A tab. Some people are putting them into the chat tab. So if you could put them in the Q&A tab, that's where they'll be filtered from. Just coming back to your point, Tony, I'll ask Christoph to answer this one, and I'll also come to Monty on one about the US government stimulus package. But first of all, looking at the support that's being sought in certain regions, do you see a longer term impact on the industry being more airlines being nationally owned, back to the kind of 1970s again?
Is that a question for me, Max?
Sorry, Christoph. Yeah, it's around nationalization of airlines.
I'm currently in a region where still most airlines are de facto state-owned, And
that's in Asia, right? You're in, just people that don't know, you're in Asia at the moment, Christoph. Yeah.
But you see, let's also not deny the fact that airlines are asking for it, that airlines are asking proactively for it in the UK, in continental Europe, and even in the United States. A 12 billion rescue package was issued. I mentioned the motivation of connectivity, which I think is a legitimate one. But the second largest argument is national employment. And particularly in times of elections, that of course scores extremely high. And that, I think, is a distortion which we should get rid of. I believe that is not a good spending of taxpayers' money, because it's not an investment, it's just spending. And it is foreseeable that demand will level out on a much lower level. I think then it's irresponsible to put taxpayers' money to artificially keep employment levels high. But Monty said it, and Tony said it as well. Probably one has to assess each and every case individually. And I remember that I had to ask for state aid shortly before Sabina went into bankruptcy. And the EU commissioner at the time was an Italian fellow, I forgot his name, and we were sitting in front of him, my chairman and I, and it was denied. We were denied state aid. And my chairman said, well, only under the condition if Alitalia will never get again state aid. That was in 2001. It's 19 years ago. And Alitalia is still alive. So that, take it as an anecdotal thing, but I would say a carrier which has fought the last 20, 30 years, privately owned, has paid dividends, pretty well managed, is now on the brink, is asking for a bridge loan. It's a completely different thing than asking for 100% equity ownership of a flag carrier which is hanging on the cliff since 20 or longer years. I think that distinction needs to be made, and every case needs to be assessed individually.
Thank you, Christoph. Monty, we've had a question which is a US government, US airline focused one, which, given your experience, hopefully you can have a few thoughts on. It was about the US stimulus bill. Do you think the implementation will be smooth, and how long do you think the big three in the US can survive if there's a delay in passing the bill?
Well, the bill has been passed. And actually talks are very active right now on there are two funding mechanisms. One's a grant, which is really for employment. As long as you keep your staff, the government will basically pay the staff costs until September. And you promise on on the logic that they're going to go to unemployment benefits anyway. So it's better that they stay employed instead of the government paying the money through unemployment insurance. And the second vehicle is a loan, and that is yet to be determined what the structure of those loans will be. They could be individually structured differently for each carrier, and those talks are basically ongoing. But after September 11th, there was a loan program for the carriers, and by the time the government put in all their wants, hardly any airline used the TARP funding, which is called, mainly because they could find better terms in the marketplace. But the fact the government was there as a backstop actually helped you find other financing in the marketplace.
And do you think that there's a risk around any of the big three making it through this, or through consolidation or through bankruptcy?
Oh, the planes will fly. Airplanes don't go away. They just get restructured and lower cost. So the capacity is going to show up somehow, and the question is who's going to operate them.
And Monty, of course, the institution of Chapter 11 is unique to the United States. It does not exist. So I think there is then kind of some time with your creditors committee to restructure and to find the way out. In Europe, it's sudden death.
Right.
I think, Monty, if I may, I think Max, the structure of the US taking the approach they've taken, at least for half of the funds, of saying to the airlines, look, okay, you know, you keep your staff on, and we'll make sure they're being paid enough to get by. And I'm not sure whether they get full pay or whether it's reduced or whatever. I don't know, but that's a detail, an important one, but a detail. But the structure to say to the airline, okay, keep yourself in shape, keep the staff available for you, so that when things get better again, you can just bring them back, start paying them yourself, and off you go. It's a good model. And in effect, that's what's helping the Australian carriers at the moment, because the government there has come up with a package where they will support staff up to what amounts to about, I think, about $1,800 or a bit more than $1,800 US a month. So staff can be stood down, but they're still on a wage that they can live on. Obviously, it's a big pay cut for lots of them, but at least they're getting some money in the door to pay the essential things, so that when the business comes back, they can then come back, and the airline can start operating again. But providing, if you like, that safety net, but allowing people to be kept on at the airline rather than just being made redundant, which is very expensive for an airline to do anyway in the short term. And then they're lost, you know, and then what are their prospects, and what are the prospects for that airline? I think it's a good approach to basically help the airline with its cash bleed towards the wage bill is a good way forward.
And the way that demand has disappeared, and if the government didn't come in and help cover some cost, I think the airlines would find it less expensive not to fly at all. And as Tony pointed out before, you're focusing on cash, and you're not going to fly, you know, a level 30% of your capacity with a 10% load factor just because you want to help the industry or the country. So I think that played into it as well.
Given all your experiences in the crisis in the past that you've detailed, when you look back, is there anything you think that you should have done differently, or did you do differently when you came to the next crisis, having learned from the previous one? Christoph, you're smiling. Obviously, you've seen a few there in different businesses across the airline sector.
Yeah, I have to admit that my learning curve was quite steep from crisis to crisis. But bottom line, I would have to say, crisis management is counterintuitive. It's in many parts very counterintuitive. And if you would follow conventional wisdom, you might do the wrong thing. Maybe I give you a couple of examples. Almost like a reflex, most airlines have done a hiring freeze in the last couple of weeks with immediate effect, right? Well, if you drop out the Premier League and you end up in the second league, and the new coach comes in and you give him a hiring freeze, not good, right? I believe if you suffocate attrition in a time of crisis, you are locked in. You need a different crew in some cases in order to weather the storm. That is one example. The second example is most airlines in a crisis have always tried to save the P&L of the running year, right? There is a lot of anxiety, and every penny is turned, and in order to just make a halfway good-looking result. What you should do instead is really to use the crisis as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to clean up your balance sheet. Currently, you see the residual values of, let's say, classic aircraft is just falling through the floor. It's a big time for impairment, and it's also a big time to build restructuring provisions on your balance sheet. It will make your P&L for the running year look terribly awful, but at least then you have a downhill battle going forward. The third thing is, intuitively, people would start cutting, let's say, catering on board, or take the blankets away from the people, or doing silly things where the cost-saving effect is insignificant in comparison to the billions which is at stake. But you really annoy your customers, and if they have the choice after a year or two, they will not come back. Investments. I mean, Or let me take another example. I see the symbolic in taking pay cuts on the C-suite level, on the executive level, to sometimes forgo the thing. But what I have learned, to weather a crisis takes 2, 3, sometimes longer years. And there is not a more important time to incentivize your staff, either with financial or also non-financial bonuses. And, you know, to wipe out incentivization and bonuses when you expect your people to work 24/7 is poor leadership. It's just poor leadership. You can do that if you are swimming in money. But these are just a couple of examples where I have learned over the years that you sometimes have to step back and not do what conventional wisdom is telling you, but really take a longer view. And you know, some people say, don't waste a good crisis. That's what I mean. You really have to work during these days on really structural changes, which are impossible to do when you pay record dividends. That's my lesson learned over the last 30 years.
Tony, from your perspective, you were obviously moving up the seniority chain at Cathay as each crisis played out, and you were CEO for the big one in 2009. Did you find you had good learnings and maybe some mistakes you'd seen others make previously?
Yeah, sure. I think one thing that that I learned from SARS, the SARS experience, was to get on with it, do things quickly, don't wait. In SARS, just to give you an example, I mean, you know, the traffic completely collapsed. What happened was that actually, I think it was the 2nd of April, 2003, the WHO put a travel advisory out saying don't go to Hong Kong. So traffic collapsed. And at the worst, we were carrying maybe 5,000 passengers a day, when at the time, we were a lot smaller than they are now, of course. 35,000 would have been a typical good day. So it was a complete collapse of traffic. And what we did, mentioned earlier, we got staff to take unpaid leave. But actually, it all happened too slowly, and the travel advisory was lifted on the 23rd of May. But of course, you know, it took us time to get this whole unpaid leave thing organized. And in the end, people were taking their unpaid leave when we were trying to grow again and recover. So, and it was interesting to me to watch from the outside this crisis. They were much quicker onto that, and they did their unpaid leave scheme really quickly. And I think they learned from that lesson. And it's a lesson that I learned going into it when the global financial crisis came. You know, don't hesitate. If you've got to do stuff, do it quickly, because if you wait, it may be too late. And of course, this plays a little bit into what Christoph was saying, was don't waste a good crisis. Looking at that, because the big lesson for that one was also don't hedge your fuel too much, you know, thinking the price can never go down. I mean, in June 2008, the prices of fuel was about, in today's dollars, something like $149. By February the next year, it was something like $38. And of course, we'd done a lot of hedging between those two numbers. And in 2008, we had a book loss of $1 billion on a hedging book. And I became the $1 billion man, and that was no fun at all. Of course, a lot of it came back as the price went up again, but you know, that was a lesson well learned.
I remember on the SARS crisis, John Leahy quipped that the load factors had dropped to single digits in Asia, and then he joked, and remember, 0 is a single digit, which really hit home how bad it was at the time. Luckily, it was just a short period, but it was pretty dramatic. Monty, apart from maybe having your most of your management team on the other side of the world when a crisis hits, what lessons have you learnt from the ones that you've experienced as a leader?
Well, all of what Tony and Christoph have said. I mean, Toronto was hit by SARS as well, and you learn speed is absolutely paramount. And so when this took place here, we could see that the COVID was going to have an impact. And the advice I was giving was two things: don't try to fly through it. I mean, when the customers aren't going to fly, they're not going to fly. So do dramatic actions fast. It's all about the cash. And you know, one of the learnings from SARS and from financial crisis is that, you know, I think airlines really need about 30% of their turnover in cash on hand. It's basically self-insurance. because when things go bad for airlines, it's usually a global or a fairly significant impact that hits other industries as well. And you know, cash is not easily at hand, or your assets value go down as well. And so that to me is one of the big lessons is you know, make sure you have the big cash reserves. Make sure you don't try to finesse a crisis. You know, do dramatic actions quickly, and take care of your staff. I mean, that's something I've learned over time, is we don't communicate enough. We don't think of the staff first, because you're trying to save the company, but the staff is the company. And yeah, so you've got to make sure that they're well taken care of and they're safe.
Thanks, Monty. So we're at 8:55 in the UK. We will run this a little bit longer than the 9 o'clock because we started late because we had those technical problems. We've got about 700 people still engaged, so that's great. Over 100 questions coming in, counting up all the time, just so you can see we are working through a few of the questions. I think I'd just be curious about what the panel think about the shape of the industry from a traffic perspective when we do finally find our way out of this. There's, you know, could there be a redatum of traffic levels, particularly perhaps with the environment aspect as well, which has been increasing pressure on the airline sector even before the virus, and also particularly around premium travel. Everyone's learning how to use Zoom and other systems like that. So perhaps there might be a change in customer behavior going forward. Is that something that you could see? Maybe Christoph, you've seen this in the past with, we've seen it recover each time when it's been predicted, but you think this time could be different?
I see three impacts on corporate travel. So the front end of the cabin. Number one, like we have seen in every crisis, the corporates immediately change their travel policies. So less people travel in lower transportation classes. The second thing you mentioned, I believe before Corona, triggered due to the US-China trade war, I believe a lot of manufacturers globally are going back to their drawing board and say, shall we not diversify or repatriate production? So that might be a consequence which just results in, let's say, less duty travel to places like Vietnam and China. And the last thing I would fully subscribe, the learning curve with my children is extraordinary. Everything happens on the internet right now. So the entire educational system has changed in days, what we tried to do in the industry for 20 years. In the back end of the cabin, I believe there is simply less discretionary spend. There will be so much small bankruptcies. People are just fearing for their job. So they will think twice to spend money on exotic tourism destination. If you take these two together, the average size of the aircraft might decline, frequency might decline, and the economies of scale are lost, on the back of which visiting friends and relatives will become more expensive. You know, mates to the Philippines and all these traffic flows we know so well. So I believe, yes, there will be a very significant impact on global aviation demand, because there is simply so much money lost. So it's inevitable, and insofar I saw the latest IATA forecast. They see it going back in their worst case scenario, September 2021. I haven't heard a lot of airline CEOs in the last weeks who would subscribe to that. I believe everybody believes that the demand level will stay muted for a longer period of time.
Tony, your view?
I generally speaking, I agree with what Christoph has said. However, I would just say, you know, at the end of the day, human beings like to travel, and people like to go away on holiday, you know, notwithstanding the environmental concerns and so on. But you know, at the end of the day, the airline industry has grown so much, and it's grown usually at double the rate of, on average, of GDP growth, because people like to travel, people like to get around. There's a whole lot of reasons why people like to do that, and I think, you know, the industry will recover. I fully agree with Christoph. There's a lot of reasons for saying recovery won't be that fast. There is one other. Can I just sort of slight digression? But there's one slight concern I've got, and that is this, the airlines have agreed, and the International Civil Aviation Organization is implementing something called CORSIA, which is the carbon offset system for international aviation. And that is based on achieving carbon neutral growth going forward from now. And the two reference years, where carbon emissions have to be no greater than, is the average of 2019 and 2020. And it was made for 2 years rather than just 1 year, because in case there was sort of fluctuations, nobody anticipated a complete collapse of traffic like this. So unless something very, something exceptional is done, the baseline year for airline carbon emissions is now going to be, the baseline quantities is going to be very much reduced over what everybody thought it was. And that is going to put an extra cost on the airlines when it comes to offsetting their fuel in future, which could have slightly more impact than I think people anticipate at the moment.
Yeah, in fact, we've been covering that particular aspect of the CORSIA rollout on FlightGlobal. So there's information on there on FlightGlobal about that, because it's clearly never been envisaged that the whole world fleet effectively would be grounded for part of the year that would be the benchmark for future calculations. So there's going to be a lot of discussion over that in the coming months. Monty, from your perspective, are you an optimist or a pessimist in terms of the way that consumer behavior will recover post the crisis?
A bit of both, of course. I mean, I think there's three elements that need to that are going to govern how fast it comes back. The first one is the desire to travel. And I think big businesses will have to repair their supply lines, and there will be business travel. Maybe not to the level it used to be. The ability to pay, which is kind of Christoph's point. I mean, there's going to be lots of people who've lost a lot of their own personal savings, and so there's not going to be that much discretionary income out there for the leisure side. But there will be some. But the third one is the safety of travel, and this one feels a little bit like SARS and September 11th put together. In that in September 11th, the traffic, at least in the US, was severely depressed, because when you got on an airplane, you weren't sure if the person sitting next to you was a terrorist or not. And you never felt safe. The airline could be safe, the airport could be safe, but I'm worried about the other traveler. And how do you make you feel safe? And that's why we take shoes off now, and we basically get scanned naked. And we're willing to travel. That's how strong travel is. You're willing to go through all this crap to get onto a plane. So I think the one thing that the industry needs to do is figure out how do we make sure that the customer feels comfortable that the person they're traveling with is a safe person to travel with, that they either had the disease and no longer carry it, or that they've had a vaccine if once it comes out and are safe. To the degree we can solve that one, I think we'll actually speed up the growth of travel.
Thanks, Mike. In fact, John Strickland has put that question in, which we've kind of touched on part of his question, but he's mentioned the fact there could be social distancing enforced for some time, which obviously would have an impact on load factors on aircraft, although it probably won't be an issue in the short to medium term load factors, unfortunately. We're just coming towards the end now, so thanks to everyone for all your great interaction. We're still over 600 participants. I think just in a way of kind of wrapping up something positive, hopefully we can look to the future and think about the recovery. And I had a question really, where you see the recovery starting, which region or which countries are best placed for recovery. Obviously it started in Asia, so presumably we could look to Asia for that. But so my two panelists from that region at the moment. Tony, where do you see the recovery, and where do you see some optimism?
Yeah, I think here, as you rightly point out, here in Asia, it started here. People are moving through the phases earlier than in other places. So I would expect it to start in Asia, but of course it depends on governments lifting their travel bans and lifting their quarantine requirements and lifting all these regulations they put in place. And the question is, what's got to happen for them to do that? How far has it got to go? What are the criteria they're going to use in deciding this? Because once you put these things in place, if you're a government, you have to have a reason for lifting it. And it's very unclear to me how they're going to go about that process. And until they do, we're not going to start recovering.
Thanks, Tony. Monty?
Sorry, trying to get my mute back on. I have no idea how this is going to, if it's going to be coming back geographically. I think, I'm kind of concerned that China now is getting disease from kind of the reverb of people outside the region coming back into the region. So this could bounce around quite a bit before, an area that's all clear. I think not until you get a vaccine or some way to kind of identify safe travelers, again, that's going to be an element in that.
Thank you. And Christoph?
Yeah, I would see China really, because they have just such a large domestic market. So they just with their domestic business, they can really support their P&L and their balance sheet much better. Other regions like Indonesia, well, there is simply no choice in modal split. If you have 18,000 islands, there is very little choice. You have to take an airplane. So I believe that Asia would be, for me, number one. I believe our visibility, how things with regard to COVID-19 develop in Europe and the United States, is simply incomplete at this point in time. Every day is so depressingly new that I would be very shy to make any prediction when that will come back to normal.
Thank you. Well, the general consensus has been that the global economy is going to enter a deep but short-lived recession. And the deep bit I don't like, but the short-lived I'm more in favour of. So let's hope that that consensus is accurate. So without going into more detail, I just want to say thank you to the panel. But first of all, apologies to Monty. It wasn't his technical problems, it was our technical problems that prevented him from being on screen. He wasn't hiding away because it's midnight and it was 1 o'clock now in the morning in Tucson. Just a reminder, before I thank everybody, that the next webinar is on the 13th, week of the 13th of April. We think it will be towards the end of that week. It's crisis management from the aerospace leaders' perspective. And if it's anything like the one we did today and last week, it will be a must-watch webinar. So stay tuned to flightglobal.com/webinars for updates on the expanding program that we're running, and also to watch the video playbacks. And this one, again, is something I'm going to have to watch back because there was so much great insight. So thank you to Monty, to Tony, and to Christoph for sharing your wisdom. It's been a fascinating hour to hear from all of you, and hopefully it's been very rewarding for everyone that's taken part. We had over 750 participants at the peak, so attendees at the peak, so thank you. Thank you also to Murdo for your help with the questions, and to Chloe and Louisa for the back-end work and working away behind the scenes to sort the technical problems out. So from Murdo and me, and from the panelists, thank you. Wherever you are, please keep safe, and until next time, goodbye.